Hello and welcome to History Goes to the Movies. I'm your host, George Beery, and in this episode, I will be talking about Ang Lee's 1995 film, Sense and Sensibility, adapted for the screen by Emma Thompson from Jane Austen's classic 1811 novel. Now, why did I choose this film? Well, first of all, it's available on Netflix, and you can all go watch it right now. Secondly, after Dunkirk, I wanted to get away from war and military history to more social history. And although Sense and Sensibility is set in a period between 1792 and 1797 that saw the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, these events don't figure directly in the story. But they do provide a really interesting context. Also, Jane Austen happens to be one of my favorite novelists, and I think this is the best film adaptation of her work that exists, and I'm ready to fight all you fans of the Pride and Prejudice miniseries over this if necessary. Now, why is Jane Austen one of my favorite authors? Because her stories are biting social commentary masquerading as trivial romantic comedy. And by the end of this video, I hope you will agree that Sense and Sensibility is not a cute romantic comedy about people living through quaint and simple olden times. No, it's a biting satire about people living through revolutionary times. Now, Jane Austen did essentially invent the romantic comedy genre as we know it, and most of its cliches. I mean, Pride and Prejudice literally came up with the whole they hate each other at first and then fall in love idea. And Sense and Sensibility invents the classic woman must choose between sexy bad boy and boring guy who turns out to actually be Mr. Right. But it's about so much more than romance. In fact, Sense and Sensibility is a satire of the social world of the English upper classes. Our heroines, the Dashwood sisters, face the twin challenge of loss of family status and lack of power within a male-dominated society. And this exposes the vanity, the cruelty, and the hypocrisy of the English gentry. So let's start by talking about the English class system of the time. Today, when we think about class, we tend to associate it with money or wealth. Like Bill Gates is really rich, so he's upper class. Middle class tends to mean people in the middle income brackets, but this is not at all how people in Jane Austen's time would have thought about social class. No, for them, class position was determined by a complex combination of one's income, yes, but also one's birth and how one earned one's living, if in fact one did. Now, this class system originated all the way back in the medieval era, where the population was said to be divided into just two broadly defined groups, the upper classes and the commoners. And the central difference between these two was work, in that the working class did all the work of producing goods, and the upper class, of course, did not. Now, the upper class had a role to play in society, which was to rule. In exchange for creating and administering the law, presiding over the usage of land, they were allowed to collect taxes from commoners. So you could say that the upper class was born to rule. The lower class was born to serve. Bruce Springsteen was born to run. Now, this was all hereditary. Class position was determined at birth and then therefore rarely would be changed. This was a world in which the assumption we have today that all people are created equal, as Thomas Jefferson said, was a notion so radical, so outside the official thinking, that it led to revolutionary violence, such as France was experiencing at the exact time this film is set. But just as the Rolling Stones observed in the 60s, however, sleepy London town was just no place for a street-fighting man. And England was not being racked with revolutions about all people were created equal. In fact, it was the main conservative force against the French Revolution and later Napoleon. In England, or at least among the characters in this film, the assumption was that people were not equal at birth or after. Some were simply inherently better than others. To give a strange-sounding example of this, in the late 18th century, upper-class parents usually did not raise their own infant children. The children were instead given to a wet nurse, a working-class woman who had recently given birth and thus could nurse both children. Parents would only come by to visit their child occasionally. Jane Austen herself was sent to live in a working-class home for the age of 3 months to 2 years old. And this was done not just to relieve upper-class women from the burden of childcare, thus allowing them to immediately return to society. It was also done because the upper class traditionally saw doing any work at all as servile, demeaning, and a marker of inferiority. For example, in the movie, the youngest Dashwood sister lets on that Eleanor's crush, Mr. Ferrers, is of no profession. Rather, he is a gentleman. Now, to us, this might make us think less of him. He's basically a member of the idle rich who sits around all day doing nothing. But to these characters, it brands him as more appealing because he's a man who does not need to reduce himself in social rank by doing work. But even more than the upper class just being lazy, the prevailing view of childhood at the time was that children were lesser beings than adults, until such time as they could make rational and coherent conversation anyway, about 7 or 8 years old. Until that time, they weren't thought of as worthy of interest or attention of adults, and therefore it was fitting to simply place them with another group of people who were beneath you, the working class. Now this might sound horrifying to you, although personally, having worked with very small children over one summer at a summer camp, I kind of sympathize, but it demonstrates that English upper-class society was one in which people were seen to be of wildly different fundamental worths based upon their age and social standing. Some people were just better than others. By Austen's time, however, the simplistic medieval notion of class was complicated by the rising middle class, or bourgeoisie, people who engaged in trade and commerce. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the Industrial Revolution in textiles was making England the richest country in the world and raising an entirely new class of people to incredible wealth. And the arrival of these people on the scene greatly complicated the situation because they were new money and had made their fortunes through commerce, so they were looked down upon by the hereditary upper class, but their money gave them the ability to travel within the same social circles and move up into the upper class through marriage. To make matters even more complicated for us, not all members of the upper class were considered equal either. There were hierarchies within hierarchies. For example, the division between the nobility and the gentry. The nobility have formal titles, duke, baron, earl, etc. You address them as sir or lady and then their first name. But most members of the upper class were not actually nobles with titles, but untitled landowners known as landed gentry. Jane Austen herself and almost all the characters about which she writes are members of this landed gentry. Gentry are referred to simply as Mr., Mrs., or Miss, for example, Mrs. Dashwood or Mr. Ferrers, and they are considered a step below the nobility in rank, but they could actually be better off financially. In fact, the larger the amount of land you owned, of course, the greater the income the land would generate, and the higher up in the social order you would be. Austen's heroines tend to be members of what's called the low gentry. Yes, members of the upper class, but at the lowest rung of that ladder, and often poorer than most members of the middle class. And in the setting of Sense and Sensibility, social class and social standing are everything. Not only did the upper classes never have social relations with the lower classes, but within the upper classes, your social circle, the people you visited and were acquainted with, were generally of similar social status to yourself. In fact, the complicated and to us seemingly arcane rules of socialization that Austen's novels portray were all rooted within the desire to maintain a social hierarchy at all times. For example, there was an unwritten rule amongst good society that to make the acquaintance of somebody new, you had to be formally introduced by a mutual acquaintance. You would never simply go up to someone you did not know and tell them your name, much less ask theirs. This rule of introduction was designed to ensure that your social circle would always be composed of people of roughly equal social status to yourself. Which is not to say that people didn't climb or fall in society. Fortunes could be lost or gained. Dissolute nobles, for example, could manage their estates poorly or gamble or drink it all away. And of course, there were those pesky capitalists going around making fortunes in business. So perhaps the most common way of gaining or losing status was that activity which is the primary subject of Sense and Sensibility and of all Jane Austen's novels: marriage. Marriage had for hundreds of years been primarily an economic relationship that served economic purposes. For the working classes, for example, the main purpose of marriage was to form a unit of production necessary to run a farm or workshop. Marriages could only proceed if both husband and wife brought something, like land, money, or goods, into the marriage. And if these were sufficient to form a viable economic unit, you could get married. Love was not enough, if indeed it was a consideration at all. For the upper classes, marriage also had economic imperatives. Families used it to combine their fortunes and therefore enhance their standing on the social ladder. This is why marriages were often arranged by parents, often years ahead of time. This is also why in England at this time, children could not legally get married without their parents' permission until the age of 21. Even after that, it was customary for the man to ask permission of the woman's father. Marriage was crucial to preserving a family's power and place in society. On the other hand, to protect against estates being divided through inheritance, the English adopted the custom of what was known as primogeniture, or leaving the entire estate to the eldest male heir. This custom was often enshrined in something called an entail. The oldest son could only inherit his father's estate on the condition that when he himself died, he would leave it to his eldest male relative, and so forth. This was legally binding, and thus the plot of the movie, in which Mr. Dashwood, upon his death, must leave his estate to his son by his first marriage, leaving his current wife and her 3 daughters to the mercy of John, who inherits the entire thing. Mr. Dashwood's deathbed appeal for John to provide for the ones he loves is truly heartbreaking, when you consider that he is utterly powerless to do so himself, due to the fact that as a condition of inheriting his estate, he had to agree to this entail. Now, obviously, this system of primogeniture served the purpose of keeping estates as large as possible and maintaining family status, but it left a lot of people behind, most notably any children who weren't the eldest son. For them to continue to live in the style to which they were accustomed and to remain within good society required them to find either a profession or to depend upon the generosity of their relatives. Eleanor makes this point clear to Mr. Ferrers when she points out that while he may make his fortune through one of the occupations acceptable for a member of his social class, usually 3, the clergy, the military, or law, since gentlewomen were barred from these professions, they had only one way to secure their position: marriage. Thus, the Dashwood sisters, as daughters of the low gentry, are in the worst possible position. Even the daughters of merchants were better off because they could bring wealth into the marriage, thus making them attractive to a member of the gentry who needed an infusion of cash. Since last names were passed down on the male side, male merchants, no matter how rich they became, often looked to marry their daughters to a member of the upper class in order to inherit an upper class title or name. Thus, the Dashwoods are in a terrible situation. They can only preserve their social standing by marrying a member of the gentry or nobility. But they are competing to find such a man with a growing class of nouveau riche women. Therefore, no upper-class man can expect to gain anything from marrying them, since they bring neither title nor wealth. If they fail to marry, furthermore, they face the prospect of economic ruin and being entirely excluded from the good society in which they were raised. They would never be able to see their friends, their extended families again. This movie is not a romantic comedy, folks. It's a story about women fighting for their very survival in the face of sexism and class snobbery. The best hope for the Dashwoods, then, is that some man of reasonable fortune will marry them out of love. Marriage for love was in Jane Austen's time gaining popularity. So-called companionate marriage was a newish doctrine that stated that the primary purpose of marriage was to provide love and companionship in the home in order to raise children well and set a moral tone for all of society. This doctrine would become much more popular in the Victorian era, beginning in 1830, but at this time, it's not entirely established. It's a little bit ambiguous. One was supposed to have affection for one spouse. However, showing too much attachment or devotion, especially in public, was considered uncouth and gauche. Perhaps this was because too much of affection for one spouse was a little bit too much like rubbing it in the face of people who were not so lucky as to be able to marry for love. One of the central themes of all Austen's novels is the conflict between idealized romantic visions of love that existed in Regency society, but the mercenary quality of marriages in practice. In the movie, the Palmers give us an example of a couple that clearly and openly despise each other. Yet Mrs. Palmer insists that they like each other very much, because to admit otherwise would be to abandon the necessary illusion that marriage was more than an economic reality. So in Sense and Sensibility, the Dashwood sisters, Marianne and Eleanor, each represent one of the two different attitudes at the time towards the institution of marriage. Marianne, played by Kate Winslet, is the classic romantic, falling in love easily and expecting to be swept off her feet by a future husband with little care for the economic realities behind any potential match. She is sensibility. Now, Eleanor, played by Emma Thompson, on the other hand, represents sense. Although she falls for Edward Ferrars, played, of course, by 90s heartthrob Hugh Grant, she does not tell him of her feelings. And today's viewer is tempted to impose our own values and romantic comedy conventions on these two. I mean, isn't Marianne right? If you love someone, shouldn't you tell them? Perhaps with a big romantic gesture? However, a Regency audience would have seen the situation very differently. Marianne's romantic notions of love and marriage would be considered not just naive and annoying, but wholly inappropriate for a woman of her position. Eleanor fails to tell Edward of her love not because she's an unfeeling or emotionally stunted person, but because she sensibly recognizes that she is beneath him, and the marriage has nothing to offer him economically. At best, he would marry her against his economic interest, and at worst, she might be interpreted as being a social climber, trying to ensnare a man far above her station, which ironically is exactly what Mr. Ferrars' other suitor, Miss Steele, is doing. Now, at this time, to be considered a gold-digging social climber would be social suicide. So when Marianne does what she does, she's actually behaving very recklessly. One central theme of the film is hypocrisy. The Dashwoods' only chance at economic survival is to get a well-off man to marry them for love, but social custom dictates that they have to avoid making it look like this is what they are trying to do. Meanwhile, men like Willoughby can just go around flirting with any women with no consequences to their actions whatsoever. If Willoughby's schemes and flirting all fall apart, he can just off and join the army, become a priest, or marry a merchant's daughter. Classic double standard. One last thing you might be wondering is, in this marriage market, everyone seems to know exactly how much money everyone else has. People throw around lines like, he has $6,000 a year. And I always wondered when I was watching and reading Austen, how the hell does everybody know how much money everyone else makes, right? And the answer is actually very simple. The incomes of the wealthy, i.e. the money they lived off of on a daily basis to buy clothes, food, carriages, pay servants, this was mostly derived from the interest on investments, chiefly fixed return permanent bonds, called the consolidated bonds or consols. These were issued by the British government to help raise money to pay for wars, including the 7 Years' War, the Napoleonic Wars, and they paid a fixed annual interest rate of 3%. Now, a secondary market also existed in which those who owned these bonds could buy and sell them at different rates than the face value based upon speculation about the government's ability to pay in perpetuity. Now, I think this was a financial win-win. The English government got money that it desperately needed for war without having to raise taxes or ever repay the principal. And those who bought the bonds got a guaranteed lifetime income for doing nothing. This all worked just as long as England didn't, for example, lose the Napoleonic Wars and default on its bonds. Furthermore, information about these investments was publicly available. So it was possible to know so-and-so had $6,000 a year, which is the annual income stated as being inherited by John Dashwood. Now, how much is this? And that's a loaded question because it's difficult to translate into modern terms. But using things like the Consumer Price Index, economists, yes, there are Jane Austen economists, have estimated that £6,000 would roughly be able to buy $500,000 worth of goods today. So John Dashwood is doing pretty well for himself. He certainly could have helped the Dashwood sisters and mother, which he doesn't. Now, the Dashwood sisters and mother, on the other hand, have to live on, it's said, £500 a year. How much is that? Well, it works out to be a little bit over $40,000. You might think that doesn't sound so bad, but keep in mind that they have no estate or fortune other than this annuity. And they are upper class. They are expected to hire servants, to own horses and carriages, to dress in fine clothes, and they need to find a house to rent. They're trying to live the good life on a budget that doesn't allow them to do so, and if they don't keep up appearances, they will not be welcome in the social world that provides them their only chance of moving up the economic ladder. So again, what looks like a silly romantic comedy is actually a story of women surviving in the face of institutionalized sexism with a vicious social circle filled with rampant hypocrisy. Now, I hope you'll keep that in mind as you watch the film, and I hope you've enjoyed this episode of History Goes to the Movies. I hope to see you next time.